Admiral Dr. Rachel Levine talks about if the LGBTQ really supports the T, and a little bit about Dave Chappelle in a White House interview with Queer News Tonight. This is part 3 of part 4. This evening, Queer News Tonight brings you Admiral Dr. Rachel Levine. She is America's first 4-star trans admiral and the first trans Senate confirmed cabinet member. Tonight, Levine talks about the LGBTQ community. Hear her thoughts about the attacks on the trans community and if the L, the G, the B, and the Q are doing enough in supporting the T. I ask her about what we have watched in America over the controversy of Dave Chappelle. Watch this.
I know that our community has President Biden's support. He has articulated that numerous times, including in his first address to Congress. We have Vice President Harris's support. We have support for our community across the administration, including at HHS with Secretary Becerra. And so I will do everything that I can in my role as the Assistant Secretary for Health to advocate for health equity and to advocate for equity, inclusion, and diversity for all members of the LGBTQI plus community.
All right. Well, and speaking of that, let's zero in on your representation in our community, the one that you just talked about. 21, as you've just said, represents really the best of times. We have never seen over the last 8 or 9 months the embracement of our LGBTQ community in history from President Biden, Vice President Harris, from the White House. Just breathtaking what we have seen, and even the desire to ensure that LGBTQ has a seat at the table. You're partially a representation of that, and there's dozens of representation of that. That is the best of times. But we're also seeing the worst of times. And the worst of times for our community is specifically aimed at trans. The state laws that are limiting medical access in states, and how we're dealing with youth in our states, and even the violence that we're seeing against the trans community. What do you think about it? Does it disappoint you that in the same space, at the same time, we're seeing amazing gains for our broad community, but really terrible situations for the T in our LGBTQI acronym?
Well, you know, whenever we see progress and we see tremendous opportunities for even more progress, it is not unusual to then see challenges, as you have been articulating. It is very challenging to see those laws in states that seek to limit the ability of transgender youth to participate in activities such as sports, and the most egregious ones that seek to limit their ability to seek standard of care medical treatment. And so, you know, at HHS and across the administration, we will do everything we can to push back against any type of laws or bills or any attempt to limit, again, the LGBTQI plus community in terms of equity, diversity, and inclusion. Transgender youth are vulnerable. They're vulnerable to bullying and harassment, and we need to support transgender youth, not seek to limit their ability to participate in sports or their ability even to access medical care.
I'm curious, after the midterm elections, I hear you in terms of your role of health versus the politics. Are you optimistic things are going to improve in these fronts for the trans community in late 22, 23, and beyond? Do you have optimism?
Well, I'm a positive and optimistic person. And so I think that things will continue to improve. Of course, we are going to see challenges, but I think that, you know, with a president that sees us and supports us, with a vice president that sees and supports us, and the support that our community has across the administration, that we will see progress.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Well, and this week I interviewed Tori Cooper. I wanted to ask you about this. Speaking of the community, we're going through some self-analysis in the LGBTQ community of where we're doing and how are we doing a good enough job. And conversations are going on all over America about what we're watching happen to the trans community, and we're challenging ourselves in the L, G, and the B, and the Q if we're doing enough. And I asked Tori Cooper from the HRC, first trans person of color ever to serve on a committee for HIV for the White House, if the the LGBTQ community was doing their part in standing up for the T. And Tori Cooper was unequivocally clear that the answer was no. Where do you think we are? Is the L and the G and the B and the Q in the community doing? You're the top voice of the trans community, certainly in America and arguably one in the world. How do you think our community is doing?
Well, I think that our community is always stronger when we stand together against the challenges that we face. And so, again, being a positive and optimistic person, I think that the trans community certainly welcomes the support of everyone in our rainbow family, so to speak. And I think that we can and will stand together.
Yeah. I also want to ask you about the broad community support for our community. There's been so much said and discussed in the last number of weeks about the Dave Chappelle special at Netflix and trans-related issues and LGBTQ-related issues. Any thoughts about what you watched in America's discussion in the community and out of the community on Dave Chappelle?
I'm not really going to comment on that, but I think it's very important to understand the progress that our LGBTQI plus community has made, but that we have to make progress for everyone, including the most vulnerable in our community. I had mentioned that LGBTQI plus youth, particularly trans youth, are vulnerable. Seniors in our community are vulnerable. Immigrants in our community are vulnerable. And really, in many ways, the most vulnerable are LGBTQI plus individuals of color. And, trans women of color, for example, are at risk not just of harassment or discrimination, but they are at risk of violence and murder. So we have to stand together. We have to work together to consolidate and then continue the progress that we have made for everyone in our rainbow family.
Well, tomorrow we are going to bring you the final part 4, where Admiral Levine talks about what is next for the LGBTQ plus community and her first reaction when I ask her if she understands the significance of her representation for our community.
What a great interview, Al. Kudos to you. But I have to ask, were you able to soften her up? Did she ever smile or laugh or giggle? I mean, and I know as a woman, we're less represented than men when it comes to everything. So you've got to show that you're not weak. You have to show that you're strong about everything and serious about everything. But did she ever maybe giggle?
She did not. In part 4, there was a moment where she gets emotional because I draw a contrast comparison of her in history compared to Bayard Rustin, to Sylvia Rivera and Harvey Milk. And the lens of time, 50, 60 years, we realize, these were icons that we didn't recognize were icons at the time that they were doing it. And I drew the contrast, well, that's what you're going to be. And she pauses and she blushes, and it was as close to an emotional outburst as you could see. It's very interesting because I've put this in front of a lot of my trans friends, and everyone's reaction is exactly the same, which is, this is completely it. The trans community generally has such a barrier built to be seen in a certain way because of fear, because of violence potential, because of employment rejection, housing rejection. They perform in a very specific way. And as I was going through this interview, I thought of that many, many, many times. She is more robotic than I would like her to be.
Okay.
But it's clear that that's who she is and what she needs to be. And of course, she's doing an incredible job for our community.
Trailblazer, beyond.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting, sorry.
No, go ahead.
When you were asking about does the LG and B support the T, you know, and I hearken back to the beginning of the AIDS pandemic where the G and the L really didn't work together or do much together, but it was a crisis that drew them in to protect their brothers and sisters. And when it comes to the T, for me at least, it's only been like a decade that it's really has risen to the point where it's a conversation or there's support service, especially in our community from like SunServe for that community. And as we get more educated on it, I think it's easier to support something than you just hear that there are people that might be trans, but you really don't know anybody. It goes back to, I don't know anyone who has AIDS, so I don't react the same way. And I was just,
Interesting to me, and you draw that, Tori Cooper, who is the first woman of color representing the trans community at the White House and for the HRC. I pointed out to Admiral Levine, she specifically, no bones about it, doesn't see the support in the L and the G and the B in the community for trans that she says we should expect. Any thoughts? And do you all agree with that our community is not supporting trans the way we should?
I would agree with you, and I think Victor, his agency deals with a lot of the T, and as his organization and others, like I said before, SunServe speak up, that brings it to the forefront and for conversation to happen, and they're in a great position to do that in a safe environment. And I don't know what Victor thinks.
Yeah, I mean, I think like any movement, everything takes time, and it's taken our community a while to get accustomed with the fact that women are referred to, same gender loving women are lesbians, not gay. People are reclaiming the word queer. And now there's the T that is more prominent in the community that we need to step up and be in support of. So we're constantly learning and evolving. What's important to Glenn's point is that there are organizations and people out in the community that are trying to do that work, that are trying to spread education, or rather educate others. Where it's always saddening is when you're met with the resistance from the members of the community that they fall back on their comfort and what they are willing to understand and not wanting to push themselves forward. And I find that happens far too often.
Yeah. And Tori Cooper makes the point, how can we expect Mississippi to support the T of our acronym if the other members of our own community don't support it? It gives us a lot to think about. LGBTQ plus news is vital for our community and for the broader world as a whole. We have enough enemies at Fox News. Tucker, Sean, and Laura are loud. We need passionate allies. Happening Out Television Network, Queer News Tonight, and It's Happening Out are literally out of the closet and into the headlines. Our community needs your support. Like this broadcast and subscribe now to ensure the growth of the entire LGBTQ